Wren's hands trembled as she held the pen above the yellowed paper of the contract. The sound of the grandfather clock echoed in the study like a cruel metronome, marking the last seconds of her freedom. She was 21 years old, her dark hair gathered in a braid that fell over her left shoulder, and her honey-colored eyes that she had inherited from her mother glistened with contained tears. The notary's office smelled of old paper and oak wood. The tall windows let in the golden light of the Napa Valley sunset, casting elongated shadows over the century-old furniture. On the walls, portraits of stern men observed the scene with immutable expressions, silent witnesses to generations of agreements sealed in this very place. Beside her, seated with the rigidity of a marble statue, was Calloway Ashworth. His expensive cologne, notes of sandalwood and bergamot, invaded the space between them like an invisible barrier. Wren didn't dare look at him directly, but she could feel his presence the way one feels the heat of a fire. Intense, dangerous, impossible to ignore. "Miss Hartwell," the notary's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I need you to sign here, here, and here." The man pointed with his plump finger to 3 dotted lines. Wren observed her own name typed beneath each one, Wren Josephine Hartwell. That name she had carried with pride for 21 years, that her grandmother from Virginia would pronounce with affection while teaching her to read emotions in people's eyes. That name which, in a matter of minutes, would be forever linked to the Ashworth name. She signed. The scratching of the pen on paper sounded like a whisper of farewell. On the other side of the table, her grandfather Ezekiel kept his gaze fixed on his own hands, weathered by decades of work in the vineyards. He was 72 years old, his face furrowed with wrinkles that told stories of scorching summers and difficult harvests. He hadn't been able to look at his granddaughter since they entered the office. Shame consumed him like fire consumes dry straw. "It's done," announced the notary, gathering the documents with mechanical efficiency. "Congratulations to the future spouses. The ceremony is scheduled for the day after tomorrow, as agreed." Calloway stood up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair peppered with premature grey at the temples. At 37 years old, he emanated a natural authority that made others feel small beside him. His face was attractive in a severe way, with a square jaw and defined cheekbones, but his grey eyes remained cold, distant, like windows looking into an empty room. "I'll send a car to pick you up tomorrow morning," he said, addressing Wren for the first time since he had entered. "There are matters we need to discuss before the ceremony." His voice was deep, professional, devoid of any emotion. He could have been speaking about export figures or commercial contracts. Wren nodded wordlessly, unable to find her voice. Calloway left the office without looking back. His footsteps echoed in the tiled hallway until they faded into silence. Only then did Grandfather Ezekiel lift his gaze. His eyes, the same honey color as his granddaughter's, were reddened. "Wren, my child." "Don't say anything, Grandfather." She approached and took his rough hands between hers. "What's done is done. I never should have. The debt. If I had been more careful with the investments—" "What happened, happened." Wren squeezed his hands firmly. "Now we can only look forward." But as she spoke those words, her mind traveled backward. She remembered the mornings of her childhood running through the vines of the small family vineyard, the evenings helping her grandfather prune the Cabernet Sauvignon vines, the nights listening to her grandmother Cordelia's stories about the old plantations of Virginia. She remembered the taste of the first grapes of each season, the aroma of wet earth after the rain, the sound of the wind whispering through the leaves of the vines. All of that was behind her now. Ahead lay only uncertainty. They left the office onto the cobblestone street of St. Helena. The sun was setting behind the terracotta roofs, painting the sky in oranges and purples. The bells of the old Presbyterian church began to toll, announcing the end of another day. To Wren, they sounded like funeral bells. "What's he like?" asked Ezekiel as they walked toward the car. "Mr. Ashworth, do you know him from somewhere?" Wren shook her head. "I only know what everyone knows. That he's the most powerful businessman in Napa Valley, that his wines are exported throughout the world, that no one dares to challenge him, and that his heart is made of stone," added Ezekiel bitterly. "They say that too." Wren remained silent. She had heard the rumors, of course. In a region where everyone knew each other, where news traveled faster than the wind through the hills, It was impossible not to have heard the story of Calloway Ashworth, the man who had been abandoned at the altar 5 years ago, the man who, since then, hadn't shown a trace of emotion, the man the local newspapers called the Ice Vintner. She wondered what kind of wound could transform someone that way, and she wondered, with a shiver, whether that ice was capable of melting, or if she was destined to spend the rest of her life beside a glacier. That night, in her small room at the family farmhouse, Wren couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the vineyards bathed in the silver light of the moon. The vines stretched in orderly rows as far as the eye could see, like soldiers in formation waiting for battle. She thought of her mother, who had passed away when she was only 7 years old. She thought of her father, who had disappeared shortly after, unable to bear the pain of loss. She thought of her grandmother Cordelia, who had raised her with love and wisdom until her last breath 3 years ago. And she thought of her grandfather, the only family she had left, the man who had sacrificed everything for her, and who now carried a guilt that didn't belong to him. The debt had been an unexpected blow. Failed investments in modern machinery, loans with abusive interest rates, a series of mediocre harvests. Suddenly, the small vineyard that had belonged to the Hartwell family for generations was on the brink of ruin. And then the Ashworth offer had appeared. It wasn't a marriage. It was a financial rescue disguised as a wedding ceremony. Wren pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. Her breath formed a small circle of fog that slowly faded away. "Grandmother," she whispered into the darkness, "what would you do in my place?" Silence was her only answer. But in some corner of her memory, she thought she heard Cordelia's voice. "Always look into the eyes, little one. Eyes never lie. And remember, there's no heart so cold that it can't be warmed by genuine kindness." Wren closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, let the tears flow freely down her cheeks. The next day, as promised, a black car came to pick her up. The driver, an elderly man with a kind expression, helped her with her small suitcase and opened the back door for her. The journey to the Ashworth estate lasted barely 20 minutes, but to Wren it felt like an eternity. The car crossed fields of vineyards that stretched to the horizon, past century-old wineries with stone roofs, bordered hills covered with oaks and redwoods. The beauty of the Napa Valley landscape was undeniable. But Wren could only think about what awaited her at the end of the road. The estate appeared suddenly, emerging after a curve like a mirage. It was an imposing construction of golden stone, with wrought iron balconies and arched windows that reflected the morning sunlight. A central courtyard with a marble fountain welcomed visitors, surrounded by olive trees and lavender bushes, whose fragrance perfumed the air. Wren stepped out of the car on trembling legs. A middle-aged woman, dressed in an impeccable uniform, waited for her at the entrance. "Welcome, Miss Hartwell. I'm Millicent, the housekeeper. Mr. Ashworth is waiting for you in the library." She led her through hallways decorated with antique tiles and period tapestries, past salons with high ceilings and period furniture. Every corner of the estate exuded wealth and tradition, but also a strange coldness, as if no one had laughed within these walls in a long time. The library was a circular room with shelves reaching to the vaulted ceiling. Thousands of leather-bound books occupied every available space, and the aroma of old paper mixed with that of candle wax. Calloway stood by the window, his back to the door, watching the vineyards that stretched beyond the garden. "Thank you, Millicent," he said without turning. "You may leave us." The housekeeper nodded and closed the door silently. Wren remained motionless in the center of the room, not knowing what to do with her hands, with her body, with the torrent of emotions threatening to overflow. Calloway finally turned. In the daylight, his features seemed less severe, though his eyes maintained that distant expression she had noticed the day before. "Please sit," he indicated a leather armchair by the unlit fireplace. "We need to talk." Wren obeyed. He remained standing as if sitting were a sign of vulnerability he couldn't allow himself. "I want you to understand something from the beginning," he began, his voice firm but not hostile. "This marriage is a business arrangement. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't expect love or devotion from you, and in return, you won't receive the same from me." Wren felt her heart constrict, but she maintained a serene expression. "I understand. You'll have everything you need," Calloway continued. "Clothes, jewelry, a generous monthly allowance. In exchange, I only ask that you fulfill the social obligations that the role of my wife requires. Events, dinners, public appearances, nothing more. And will we live here? Asked Wren, finally finding her voice. Together? A muscle tensed in Calloway's jaw. This estate has more than 40 rooms. You won't have to see me if you don't wish to. The words should have been a relief, but they sounded like a sentence. Wren nodded slowly. There's something else, he added, and for the first time he seemed uncomfortable. My mother lives here. Mrs. Vivian. She doesn't approve of this marriage. I ask that you ignore any comments she might make. She's a difficult woman, but she's my mother. Wren remembered the rumors about Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, a woman from New York high society who had arrived in Napa Valley as a young bride and had never quite adapted to rural life. They said she was as cold as her son, though for different reasons. I'll keep that in mind, replied Wren. Calloway observed her for a moment as if trying to decipher something in her face. Then he looked away. The ceremony will be tomorrow at 5 in the afternoon in the estate chapel. Afterward, there will be a reception for the guests. I expect you to be ready. He headed toward the door, but before leaving he stopped. One more thing, Wren. She looked up, surprised to hear her name on his lips. I'm not the monster people think I am, he said quietly, but I'm also not a man capable of offering what most expect from a marriage. I just wanted you to know that. And before she could respond, he disappeared through the door, leaving her alone with the echo of his words and the weight of an uncertain future. The afternoon of the following day arrived too soon. The sky above the estate was painted in golden and crimson tones, as if nature had decided to celebrate what humans had turned into a cold transaction. The leaves of the trees danced in the autumn breeze, detaching from the branches to form crunchy carpets on the garden paths. Wren observed herself in the full-length mirror of the room that had been assigned to her. The wedding dress was simple. She herself had insisted on that, ivory silk that fell in soft lines to the floor. She wore neither veil nor tiara, only a small bouquet of wildflowers she had asked to be gathered from the surrounding fields. Lavender, rosemary, wild poppies, the scents of her childhood. You're beautiful, my child. Her grandfather's voice came from the doorway. Ezekiel had come dressed in his best suit, the same one he had worn at his own wedding 50 years ago. It was a bit large on him now, as if the years had stolen not only youth, but also physical substance. Thank you, grandfather. Wren turned to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Are you ready? I should be the one asking you that question. Wren breathed deeply. Was she ready? No. She would never be ready to marry a stranger, to deliver her life to a man who saw her as part of a business contract. But she had learned something important from her grandmother, Cordelia. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going despite it. Let's go, she said, taking her grandfather's arm. The estate chapel was an architectural gem from the 19th century, with stone walls covered in ivy and stained glass that projected rainbows of light onto the carved wooden pews. 100 guests occupied the seats, whispering among themselves as they waited for the bride's arrival. Wren didn't know any of them. They were business partners, local politicians, members of influential families from across the region. She had come to be observed, evaluated, judged. Calloway awaited her by the altar, impeccable in a dark suit that accentuated the breadth of his shoulders. His expression was unreadable, though Wren noticed that his hands, intertwined in front of him, showed a slight tremor. Eyes never lie. She remembered her grandmother's words. And when he lifted his gaze to watch her advance down the aisle, Wren searched his grey eyes for some sign of what he was feeling. What she found surprised her. There was no coldness, no indifference. There was nervousness, uncertainty, something that looked suspiciously like vulnerability. The priest began the ceremony with words that Wren barely heard. Her mind was focused on the man before her, on the warmth of his fingers when he took her hand to exchange rings, on the way his deep voice faltered almost imperceptibly as he pronounced the vows. I, Calloway Sebastian Ashworth, take you, Wren Josephine Hartwell, to be my lawfully wedded wife. The words echoed in the chapel like an echo of ancient promises. Wren felt the weight of the gold ring sliding onto her finger, cold at first, but slowly warming with the heat of her skin. When her turn came, she pronounced the vows in a clear, firm voice, refusing to show weakness before the curious eyes of the guests. If she was going to be Calloway Ashworth's wife, she would at least be so with dignity. "You may kiss the bride." The moment Wren had dreaded arrived too quickly. Calloway leaned toward her, and for an instant their faces were inches apart. She could see the small wrinkles around his eyes, the beginning of grey at his temples, the shadow of beard that darkened his jaw. And she could also see something else, an internal conflict, a battle being waged behind that facade of ice. The kiss was brief, barely a brush of lips, but Wren felt an electric shock run through her from head to toe. They separated quickly, both avoiding the other's gaze. Applause filled the chapel. The guests rose to their feet, smiling and congratulating the couple as if this were a genuine celebration of love. No one seemed to notice, or perhaps no one wanted to notice, the palpable tension between the newlyweds. The reception took place in the main hall of the estate, a majestic space decorated with crystal chandeliers and tapestries depicting scenes of past harvests. Waiters circulated with trays of canapes and glasses of Napa Valley Reserve, while a chamber orchestra played soft melodies in a corner. Wren moved among the guests like an actress on stage, smiling, thanking congratulations, answering empty questions with equally empty answers. At her side, Calloway fulfilled his role with the efficiency of someone who had attended hundreds of similar events. "Dear, you look radiant." A woman of elegant appearance approached them, glass in hand. "Although I must say the dress is a bit modest for an Ashworth bride." It was Mrs. Vivian. Wren recognized her immediately from the portraits she had seen in the estate's hallways. She was a woman in her early 60s, still beautiful in an aristocratic way, with silver hair gathered in an impeccable bun and jewelry that probably cost more than Grandfather Ezekiel's entire property. "Mother," Calloway's voice sounded sharp, "Wren chose her dress, and it looks perfect on her." "Mrs." Vivian's eyes gleamed with something that could have been surprise or irritation. "Of course, son, I was only making an observation." She turned to Wren with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to the family, dear. I hope you'll adapt soon to our customs." And with that farewell loaded with hidden meanings, she moved away toward a group of guests who were waiting for her. "I'm sorry," Calloway murmured. "I told you she was difficult." "Don't worry," replied Wren. "I've dealt with difficult people before." He looked at her with a strange expression, as if seeing her for the first time. "Have you? My grandmother used to say that the most difficult people are those who most need understanding." Wren shrugged, although sometimes it's hard to remember that. A shadow of a smile crossed Calloway's face, so fleeting that Wren wasn't sure she had seen it. "Your grandmother was a wise woman." She was. The party continued for hours. Toasts, speeches, dances. Wren let herself be carried by protocol, counting the minutes until she could escape to the solitude of her room. And when finally the orchestra played the last melody, and the guests began to leave, she felt a relief so deep that her legs nearly gave way. But then she remembered. This was her wedding night. The main suite was in the east wing of the estate, with windows overlooking the vineyards bathed in the silver light of the moon. It was an enormous room, dominated by a canopy bed of carved wood and burgundy velvet curtains. Scented candles had been lit in every corner, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Wren entered first, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. She stood by the window, her back to him, unable to face what might happen. She heard the door close, Calloway's footsteps approaching. Then silence. "You don't have to be afraid." His voice sounded softer than she expected. "I'm not going to. I don't expect anything from you tonight." Wren turned slowly. He was several feet away, hands in his pockets, his tie loosened. He seemed as uncomfortable as she was. "Then what do we do?" she asked with sincerity. Calloway let out a sigh. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never done this before, marriage, I mean." "Well, I almost did once, but—" He interrupted himself, looking away. "I know," said Wren softly. "I've heard the story. Everyone knows it." Bitterness tinted his voice. "The story of the idiot who was left at the altar, the laughingstock of all of Napa Valley. I don't see you that way." He looked up, surprised. "No. And how do you see me?" Wren considered the question. She studied him under the dim candlelight, searching for the right words. "I see a man who was deeply wounded and who built very high walls so that no one could hurt him again." Silence stretched between them. Calloway looked at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see beyond her skin, beyond her bones, to the very core of her being. "You're too perceptive for your age," he finally said. "My grandmother taught me to read people." "It seems she taught you many things." "She taught me the most important thing, that everyone deserves a second chance." Calloway looked away toward the window. The full moon shone over the vines, transforming the landscape into a sea of silver and shadows. And what if some people don't want a second chance? Then maybe they just need time. Wren sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. Or maybe they need someone to show them that it's worth taking the risk again. He remained silent for so long that Wren thought the conversation had ended. But then slowly he walked to the window and sat on the sill, looking outside. "You can keep the bed," he said. "There's a sofa in the dressing room. I'll sleep there." "You don't have to do that. This is your room." "It's our room now," he corrected, "and I'm not going to force you to share a bed with a stranger." The word stranger echoed in the air, because that's what they were. Two strangers united by a contract, trying to navigate the turbulent waters of a situation that neither of them had chosen. Wren removed her shoes and lay back on the bedspread, not bothering to change her dress. She was too tired, physically and emotionally, to move. "Calloway," she called, when he was heading toward the dressing room. "Yes." "Thank you. For being kind." He stopped in the doorway. From where she was, Wren could only see his silhouette outlined against the dim light of the dressing room. "Don't thank me yet," he replied. "You barely know me." And then he disappeared, leaving her alone with the sound of her own breathing and the distant gleam of stars over Napa Valley. The hours passed. Wren couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in the enormous bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the estate, the creaking of wooden beams, the distant howl of the wind, the occasional murmur of voices on some lower floor. Finally, she gave up. She got up and walked toward the dressing room door, which had been left ajar. She pushed it gently. Calloway was sitting on the sofa, completely awake, looking out a small window. He had changed his suit for an unbuttoned white shirt and dark trousers. In his hand he held a glass of red wine that he didn't seem to have touched. "You can't sleep either," Wren observed. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "I never sleep well," he admitted. "It's something I've learned to live with." "Since 5 years ago?" The question was direct, perhaps too much so. But something in the intimate atmosphere of that night encouraged her to speak without filters. Calloway took a sip of wine before answering. "Since before, actually. But yes, it got worse after." "What happened? Do you want to talk about it?" "No. That's okay." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who have accepted each other's presence without feeling the need to fill it with empty words. "And you?" Calloway asked after a while. "Why did you accept this? You could have said no. No one can force you to marry against your will." Wren considered the question. "My grandfather would have lost everything. His house, his vineyards, his dignity. He's been working that land for 60 years. I couldn't allow him to end his days in ruin. So you sacrificed yourself for him." "I don't see it as a sacrifice," she corrected. "I see it as an investment." Calloway raised an eyebrow. "An investment? In my family, in his future, and perhaps," she hesitated, "in mine." "You're optimistic." "I'm realistic," she corrected him. "I know this marriage isn't what either of us would have chosen, but we're here. We can spend the rest of our lives regretting it, or we can try to make something good of the situation." Calloway studied her with those gray eyes that seemed to see more than they showed. "You're different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more typical." "Typical? Someone who would have come looking for my money, my social position, who would have tried to seduce me or manipulate me." Wren let out a soft laugh. "I'm sorry, but I'm not very good at any of those things." For the first time, Calloway smiled. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible, but it transformed his face in a way Wren wouldn't have believed possible. "I can tell." They stayed there in that small dressing room until the first lights of dawn began to tint the sky pink and orange. They talked about unimportant things, his favorite wines, her grandmother's recipes, the peculiarities of Napa Valley weather. And when finally the sun emerged over the hills, Wren realized something surprising. For the first time since everything had begun, she didn't feel completely alone. The following weeks established a strange but functional routine. Wren and Calloway inhabited the same house, shared some meals, attended mandatory social events together, but maintained a cordial distance in everything else. He immersed himself in the work of the wineries, spending long hours in meetings with winemakers and distributors. She explored the estate, learning its secrets, getting to know the employees, familiarizing herself with a world so different from her own. It was during one of those explorations that she discovered the forbidden room. It was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a hallway that seemed to lead nowhere. The door was dark wood with nothing to distinguish it from the others, but it had an antique lock that clearly hadn't been designed to be opened easily. Curiosity, as often happened with her, was stronger than prudence. It took her several days to find the key. She discovered it by accident, hidden in a drawer of the desk in Calloway's study, while she was looking for paper to write a letter to her grandfather. It was a small key of oxidized bronze, with an intricate design that made it different from all the others. That night, when she was sure Calloway had left for a business dinner in Calistoga, she went up to the 3rd floor with her heart racing. The key turned in the lock with a soft click. The door opened with a groan of rusty hinges, and what Wren found on the other side left her breathless. It was an art studio. The walls were covered with paintings of all sizes, leaning against each other, overlapping, creating an overwhelming mosaic of colors and shapes. Easels with half-finished canvases occupied the center of the room. Brushes, tubes of paint, stained palettes covered every available surface. The aroma of oil and turpentine floated in the air, mixed with dust and neglect. Wren walked among the paintings as one walks through a dream. The paintings portrayed landscapes of Napa Valley, vineyards under stormy skies, arid hills bathed in bloody sunsets, lonely paths that lost themselves in infinite horizons. But there was something in each of them, an indefinable quality that made her throat tighten. They were beautiful, and they were devastatingly sad. Each brushstroke seemed charged with melancholy. Each shadow whispered stories of solitude and loss. It was like peering into someone's soul and finding a desolate landscape where color had been slowly drained, leaving only shades of gray and ochre and the dark blue of a starless sky. "What are you doing here?" Calloway's voice made her turn so abruptly she almost tripped over an easel. He stood in the doorway, still in his business dinner suit, his face tense in a way Wren hadn't seen before. His eyes, usually distant, burned with an emotion she couldn't identify. Anger? Shame? Something deeper? I found the key," she stammered. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have." He entered the room with stiff steps, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time in a long time. "How long have you been painting?" asked Wren, forgetting for a moment that she should be apologizing. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Since I was a child, but I stopped years ago." "Why?" Calloway didn't answer immediately. He approached one of the canvases leaning against the wall and turned it to see it better. It was a portrait of a young woman with blonde hair and a bright smile. Rosalind. It had to be her. "Because I had nothing left to express," he finally said. "Or maybe because I had too much and didn't know how to handle it." Wren approached him slowly, like one approaches a wounded animal. "These paintings are incredible. Sad, but incredible. They're funeral honors," he replied with bitterness. "Monuments to everything I lost. It doesn't have to be that way." He looked at her with disbelief. "And what do you suggest? That I go back to painting cheerful landscapes full of sun and hope?" "No," Wren shook her head. "I suggest you paint what you feel now, not what you felt then." "And what do I feel now?" She held his gaze without wavering. "I don't know, but maybe it's time to find out." Silence stretched between them, dense and charged with possibilities. Calloway was the first to look away. "You should go to bed, it's late. And you?" "I'll stay here for a while." Wren nodded and headed toward the door, but before leaving she stopped. "Calloway." "Yes?" "Thank you for not getting angry at me. For coming in here, I mean." He let out something that could have been a bitter laugh or a sigh of resignation. "It's hard to get angry at you, Wren, even though sometimes I wish I could." And with those enigmatic words echoing in her ears, she descended the stairs toward her room, wondering what other secrets that man was hiding behind his walls of ice. The harvest festival arrived with the sweet aroma of ripe grapes and the bustle of hundreds of workers preparing for the harvest. It was the most important event on the Napa Valley calendar, a celebration dating back decades that brought entire families together around the land that gave them their livelihood. The main winery of the Ashworths, located on the outskirts of St. Helena, was an impressive construction of stone and wood that housed thousands of oak barrels where the reserve wines slept their long-aging sleep. That day, the doors were wide open, welcoming neighbors, partners, and curious people who wanted to participate in the festivities. Wren had spent weeks preparing for the event. She had helped with the decoration, had learned the names of all the employees, had practiced the welcome speeches she would have to give as the owner's wife. She wanted to prove she was more than a decorative piece in a marriage of convenience. The afternoon began without incident. The orchestra played traditional Californian melodies, while guests sampled wines and appetizers in the winery gardens. The September sun warmed without burning, and the laughter of children playing among the vines filled the air with joy. No one noticed the smoke at first. It was Wren who saw it, a grey thread rising from one of the windows of the old wing of the winery, where the most valuable barrels were stored. At first she thought it was steam, perhaps from some cleaning process, but then the thread became a column, and the column a black cloud. "Fire!" she shouted, running toward the winery. "There's fire in the warehouse!" Chaos erupted. Guests began to disperse while employees ran in all directions looking for extinguishers, hoses, anything that could stop the flames. Calloway appeared out of nowhere, his face tense with worry. "Call the fire department," he ordered, shouting, "and get everyone out of here." But Wren didn't hear the order. Her mind was elsewhere, in a distant conversation with her grandfather Ezekiel decades ago, when he had told her about the irrigation systems that the old California missions had built in the oldest properties of the valley. "The channels!" she exclaimed, grabbing Calloway's arm. "This winery has underground irrigation channels from the mission era. My grandfather told me about them. If we can open the gates..." "What are you talking about?" "Water. There are underground reservoirs connected to the winery. They built them to cool the warehouses in summer. If we find the valves..." Calloway looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "Are you sure about this?" "No," she admitted, "but it's the only option we have before the fire department arrives." He nodded sharply. "Show me." They ran together toward the back of the winery, where the ancient stone showed signs of even older constructions. Wren searched frantically, remembering her grandfather's descriptions, until she found what she was looking for, a rusty iron lever, half hidden among the ivy. "Help me," she gasped, pulling with all her strength. Calloway joined her. Together, they pushed the lever until it gave way with a screech of metal against stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a muffled roar emerged from the depths, and a torrent of water began to gush from hidden conduits in the walls of the winery. The fire fought against the water for interminable minutes. Smoke, steam, and ash filled the air, making it almost impossible to breathe. Wren and Calloway stayed together, watching, waiting, praying in silence. When the firefighters finally arrived, the worst had passed. The fire was under control. The winery, though damaged, had been saved, and the reserve barrels, the most precious treasure of the Ashworths, remained intact. The employees surrounded Wren as if she were a hero. They hugged her, thanked her. Some even cried with relief. She was covered in soot, her dress ruined, her hair soaked, but she smiled with an authentic joy that illuminated her ash-stained face. Calloway watched her from a distance, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt something crack inside his chest, something he had believed dead forever. That night, when the party had turned into an improvised celebration of the saved winery, he found her sitting alone on a garden bench, looking at the stars. "You should be inside," he said, sitting beside her. "You're the hero of the day." Wren shook her head. "I just remembered something my grandfather told me. Anyone could have done it, but no one else did." She shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Calloway, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you accept this marriage? I mean, you didn't need to save any vineyard. You could have married any woman from your social circle. Why me?" He was silent for so long that Wren thought he wasn't going to answer. "My father," he finally said. "Mr. Edward. He retired to a monastery in New Mexico years ago. But he still controls the company through legal clauses. He won't transfer the presidency to me unless I marry." "But you could have married anyone." "Yes," he admitted. But after what happened with Rosalind, I couldn't stand the idea of, he paused, searching for words, of pretending to love again, of building something on lies. At least with you, everything is clear from the beginning. We know exactly what this is. Ren nodded slowly, processing the information. And what is this, exactly? He looked at her with those grey eyes that gleamed under the starlight. I don't know, he confessed, but I think it's starting to be something more than I expected. His words hung in the night air, full of possibilities that neither of them dared to name yet. Autumn advanced relentlessly over Napa Valley, painting the vineyards red and gold, while leaves fell forming crunchy carpets on the paths. Ren had found her rhythm at the estate. She spent her mornings learning about wine production with the winemakers, her afternoons exploring the surroundings or writing letters to her grandfather, and her evenings in increasingly longer conversations with Calloway. Something had changed between them after the fire. It couldn't be called love, it was too early, too fragile for that word, but there was a connection that grew day by day, like the roots of a vine seeking water in the deep earth. That was when Rosalind appeared. She arrived unannounced, in a red sports car that raised a cloud of dust as it stopped in front of the main entrance. Ren saw her from the window of her room, a blonde woman of striking beauty, dressed with an elegance that screamed money and sophistication. She knew who it was before anyone told her. Something in the way she walked, in the familiarity with which she headed toward the door, made her understand that this was the woman who had shattered Calloway's heart. She didn't go down to receive her. She stayed by the window watching while Rosalind disappeared inside the estate. The minutes passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. She went down the stairs cautiously, following the sound of voices coming from the main salon. It was a terrible mistake, Calloway. I know that now. I've thought about you every day of these 5 years. Rosalind's voice was melodious, persuasive, loaded with an emotion that seemed genuine. Ren stopped behind a column in the inner courtyard, close enough to hear but hidden from view. And what do you expect me to do with that information? Calloway's voice sounded tense, controlled. 5 years have passed, Rosalind. I'm married. I know, but that marriage, and everyone knows it was a business arrangement. It's not real. Ren's heart clenched painfully. That's none of your business. Calloway, please. What we had was special. What I did. I was manipulated. Frederick filled my head with lies about you, convinced me you didn't love me, that you only wanted me as a trophy. And you believed him. I was young and stupid. But I've changed. I've matured. And I've come back because I need you to know the truth. A long silence. Ren barely dared to breathe. The truth is that it doesn't matter anymore, Calloway finally said. What happened, happened. I've moved on. Really? Rosalind's voice became softer, intimate. Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't feel anything anymore. Another silence. This one longer, more loaded with meaning. Ren felt tears threatening to overflow. She didn't want to hear anymore. She retreated silently, ran up the stairs, and locked herself in her room. Hours passed without Calloway appearing. She sat by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky blood and gold, wondering if everything she had believed she was building in recent weeks had been nothing more than an illusion. After all, she thought bitterly, why would he choose to stay with me when he can get back the woman he loved? When there was finally a knock on her door, it was almost midnight. May I come in? Calloway's voice sounded tired. She hesitated, but finally nodded. He entered slowly, closing the door behind him. He had the look of someone who had fought an internal battle, with disheveled hair and loosened tie. I suppose you heard. It wasn't a question. Part of it, Ren admitted. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I know. He sat on the edge of the bed, several feet from where she remained by the window. She's gone, he said. I asked her to leave and not come back. Ren felt something loosen in her chest, but she didn't allow herself to show relief. Why? Because when she asked me to look her in the eyes and tell her I felt nothing, I realized it was true. I don't feel anything for her anymore. And that surprised you? Yes, he confessed. I spent 5 years convincing myself that love was a weakness, that I would never feel anything for anyone again. And suddenly, there she was, the woman for whom I thought a part of me had died. And the only thing I could think was—" He interrupted himself, running a hand through his hair. "Was what?" Wren asked softly. Calloway lifted his gaze. His grey eyes shone with an emotion she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. "Was that I wanted to come back here with you." The silence filled with unspoken words. Wren felt her heart beating so hard he could surely hear it. "Calloway, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted her, standing up. "I just wanted you to know the truth, to know that when I said this was starting to be something more than I expected, I meant it." He headed toward the door, but before reaching it, she spoke. "Calloway." He stopped without turning. "Me too," she whispered. "I also feel this is more than I expected." He remained motionless for a moment. Then, without turning, he nodded almost imperceptibly and left the room. But that night, when Wren finally could sleep, she dreamed of sun-bathed vineyards, and a man with grey eyes who looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he had stopped asking long ago. Winter arrived early that year, covering the hills of Napa Valley with a fine layer of frost that made the dormant vineyards glisten as if covered in diamonds. The estate closed in on itself, the fireplaces lit day and night, the aroma of burning wood mixing with that of the traditional dishes that Millicent prepared in the kitchen. Wren woke up one morning with nausea that forced her to run to the bathroom. She told herself it was something she had eaten, perhaps the lamb from the previous night's dinner. But when the nausea continued day after day, when exhaustion became constant, and her body began to feel strangely foreign, she knew something else was happening. The confirmation came unexpectedly. She had gone to St. Helena to visit her grandfather, Ezekiel, taking advantage of a morning when Calloway had meetings at the wineries. While waiting in the market square, a sudden dizziness made her lose her balance. An elderly woman helped her sit on a bench and, with the wisdom of someone who has seen many things in life, asked her with a knowing smile, "How many months along are you, dear?" Wren froze. That afternoon at the corner pharmacy, she bought a pregnancy test with trembling hands. She hid it in her bag as if it were contraband and waited until she was alone at home to use it. The result was unmistakable, 2 pink lines that changed everything. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, looking at the small plastic device as if it were an object from another world. A baby. She was expecting a baby. The child of a man she had been married to for barely 3 months. A man who had made clear from the beginning that this was a marriage of convenience, without love or romantic expectations. How would Calloway react? Things had improved between them, yes. There were conversations, shared moments, even flashes of something that could be tenderness. But a child changed everything. A child was permanent, real, impossible to ignore or negotiate. Fear paralyzed her, for days, weeks. She kept the secret like someone keeping a time bomb in her chest. She smiled during dinners, participated in conversations, fulfilled her obligations as the wife of the region's most important businessman. But inside, anxiety consumed her slowly. The symptoms worsened. The nausea turned into constant vomiting. The exhaustion became so deep that sometimes she could barely get out of bed. But every time Calloway asked if she was okay, she smiled and said it was just a winter cold. It was Mrs. Vivian who discovered the truth. It happened almost by accident. Wren had left the bathroom door without closing it, thinking she was alone in that wing of the estate. When nausea forced her to lean over the sink, she didn't hear the footsteps approaching down the hallway. "Well, well," her mother-in-law's voice sounded like a whip. "So the peasant is pregnant?" Wren straightened up sharply, her face pale as wax. "Mrs. Vivian, Don't tell me anything." The older woman looked at her with a mixture of contempt and something else, something that looked like satisfaction. "I knew you were an opportunist, but this exceeds my expectations. Getting yourself pregnant to make sure my son can never get rid of you. Very clever." "It's not like that." Wren felt tears threatening to burst forth. "This wasn't planned. I haven't told Calloway yet because—" "Because what?" "Because you were afraid he'd throw you out when he found out about your little trap." "No." Wren's voice rose more than she intended. "Because I'm afraid he won't want this baby, that this will ruin the little we've built." Mrs. Vivian studied her with narrowed eyes. For a moment, something like compassion crossed her face, but it disappeared so quickly that Wren thought she had imagined it. "I'm going to give you some advice, girl," she said in a cold voice. "Tell my son before he finds out some other way. Secrets in this family have a way of coming out at the worst possible moments. And with those cryptic words, she walked away down the hallway, leaving Ren alone with her fear and shame. But Ren didn't follow the advice. Days passed, and she still couldn't find the moment, the words, the courage necessary to speak. And meanwhile, her body betrayed her. Fainting spells became frequent. The weight she was losing became increasingly noticeable. The dark circles under her eyes told stories she didn't want to tell. Calloway realized something was wrong. He watched her with growing concern, repeatedly asked if she needed to see a doctor, insisted she rest more. But every time he got too close to the truth, she found an excuse to pull away. She was building a wall of lies, brick by brick, not realizing that each lie distanced her further from the man with whom she had begun to dream of a future. The great winter event was the annual dinner with investors. Businessmen from San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York gathered at the estate to discuss projections, sign contracts, and above all, let themselves be impressed by the opulence of the Ashworths. Ren had spent days preparing. She had memorized names, faces, data about each of the guests. She had chosen an elegant dark green velvet dress that concealed the changes in her body. She had applied makeup carefully to hide the pallor and dark circles. She was determined to prove she was worthy of being Calloway's wife. What she hadn't anticipated was the betrayal. The dinner began without incident. 30 guests seated around a table decorated with silver candelabras and winter flower centerpieces. Waiters circulated with exquisite dishes, while conversations flowed around exports, appellations, and predictions for the next harvest. Ren felt dizzy, but she forced herself to smile, to participate, to be present. Calloway, seated beside her, touched her hand from time to time, small gestures of complicity that no one else noticed. It was during the second course that Mrs. Vivian stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced in a clear voice, "I would like to propose a toast. To my son and his lovely wife, and to the wonderful news that will soon fill this house with joy." Ren felt the world stop. "News?" someone asked. "What news are you talking about, Mrs. Vivian?" Her mother-in-law's smile was sharp as a knife. "Don't you know? Our dear Ren is expecting a child, an heir for the Ashworths." Silence fell over the table like a slab. All eyes turned to Ren, who felt heat rising to her cheeks while the floor seemed to open beneath her feet. "Of course," Mrs. Vivian continued with venomous sweetness, "some might wonder how it's possible for such a recent marriage to already be bearing fruit. But I suppose youth is impatient, isn't it?" The whispers began. Ren could hear fragments. She trapped him. That's why he married her. Typical gold digger. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't respond. The tears she had contained for weeks finally overflowed. Calloway stood up abruptly, his face a mask of contained fury. "Mother!" His voice was pure ice. "That was completely inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" Mrs. Vivian feigned surprise. "I was only sharing happy news. Out." The word resonated in the silence. All the guests held their breath. "Excuse me?" "I said out. From this room. From this dinner. Now." For a moment, mother and son faced each other with their gazes. Finally, Mrs. Vivian, with wounded but intact dignity, left the dining room without another word. But the damage was done. Ren sobbed uncontrollably, conscious of all the eyes upon her, conscious that her secret had been exposed in the worst possible way. She stood up clumsily, nearly knocking over her wineglass, and fled from the dining room. She heard Calloway's voice saying something to her, but she didn't stop. She ran through the hallways, down the garden stairs, and didn't stop until she reached the garden of olive trees and jasmine that she had come to love so much. She let herself fall onto the wet grass, not caring about the cold or the dampness soaking her dress. Sobs shook her like waves, finally releasing all the fear, shame, and loneliness she had accumulated over weeks. It was there that Calloway found her. He didn't say anything. He knelt beside her on the wet grass, not caring about ruining his designer suit. He took her hands between his and waited. When the sobs finally calmed, Ren looked up. Calloway's eyes gleamed under the moonlight, and there was something in them she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked in a low voice. "I was afraid," she confessed. "Afraid you wouldn't want it, that this would change everything, that you would regret choosing me." "Ren, His voice broke slightly. Nothing that happened tonight changes what I feel. And what do you feel? He lowered his gaze to their intertwined hands. I feel that for the first time in 5 years, I want to wake up every morning. I feel that when I look at you, something that was dead inside me starts coming to life. I feel that this baby isn't a problem to solve, but a miracle I don't deserve. Wren's tears began to flow again, but this time they were different. Calloway. I should have realized sooner, he continued. I should have noticed you were suffering alone. But I was so used to keeping distances, to protecting myself, that I didn't see what was right in front of me. He moved closer until their foreheads almost touched. Forgive me, he whispered, for my mother, for not being more present, for not making you feel safe enough to tell me the truth. You don't have to ask for forgiveness, she replied. I should have. No, he interrupted softly. We both made mistakes. But if you give me the chance, if you give us the chance, I promise that from now on we'll be a team, in everything. The scent of night jasmine enveloped them. The distant sound of the forgotten party mixed with the murmur of the wind through the olive trees. And under the silver light of the moon, illuminating the Mayakamas mountains in the distance, two people who had started as strangers took the first real step towards something that looked very much like love. I believe you, Wren finally said, and I give you the chance. Calloway helped her up with gentleness, as if afraid of breaking her. And when they walked back toward the estate, they did so together, hand in hand, leaving behind the humiliation and pain to embrace an uncertain but hopeful future. The following days were ones of rebuilding. Mrs. Vivian had retired to her private apartment in Manhattan, claiming she needed space to reflect. Wren suspected she simply couldn't stand having lost the battle against her daughter-in-law, but she didn't tell Calloway. Some things were better left unsaid. The pregnancy progressed slowly, but steadily. Once she stopped hiding it, Wren's body responded with relief. The nausea began to subside, color returned to her cheeks, and a new energy invaded her every morning. It was during those weeks of calm that she found the journal. She was exploring the library, looking for books on the history of Napa Valley to better understand the land that was now her home. On a high shelf, almost hidden behind dusty volumes on enology, there was a notebook bound in dark red leather. She opened it with curiosity and immediately recognized the elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. On the first page, an inscription, Journal of Ophelia Montague Ashworth, Year of Our Lord 1952. Calloway's grandmother, the same one who, according to what he had told her in one of their nighttime conversations, had retired to a contemplative monastery in Vermont with her husband Archibald, where they lived in meditation and silence. Wren knew she should put the journal back in its place, but something pushed her to keep reading, and what she found in those yellowed pages changed her way of seeing everything. Ophelia had been a young girl of barely 18 when she was married to Archibald Ashworth, a man 20 years her senior, heir to the most important wineries in Napa Valley. She came from a small town in the south, daughter of poor farmers who saw in that marriage the salvation of their family. I don't know this man who will be my husband, Ophelia had written in trembling script. I only know that his eyes are cold, and that his world is so different from mine that I might as well be on the moon. How am I going to live like this? Wren felt a shiver of recognition. The following pages narrated the first months of marriage. The loneliness, the bewilderment, the feeling of being a stranger in a strange land. But they also narrated something else, the slow melting of Archibald's walls, the small gestures of kindness that began to appear, the nighttime conversations that stretched until dawn. Today I found him in the garden, pruning the roses with his own hands. Ophelia had written a year after the wedding. When I asked him why he did it himself, instead of leaving it to the gardeners, he looked at me with a smile and said, "Because they were my mother's favorite roses, and tending them makes me feel close to her." At that moment I understood something important. Behind the mask of a powerful man, there's a child who still mourns his mother, and that child can be loved. Wren turned the pages eagerly, absorbing the love story that had blossomed in circumstances so similar to her own. Years of marriage documented in faded ink, joys and sorrows, conflicts and reconciliations, the birth of children, including Edward, Calloway's father, the patient construction of a shared life. And then she found the entry that made her cry. After 40 years, I can say this with certainty. True love isn't born ready. It's built, day by day, choice by choice. Every morning that I choose to stay, every night that I choose to forgive, every moment that I choose to see the best in him. That's love. Not the fireworks of the beginning, but the constant warmth of a fireplace that never goes out. And that warmth, dear granddaughter, who may someday read these words, is the most precious thing that exists. Wren closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. It was as if Calloway's grandmother had spoken to her directly through time, offering her the hope she so desperately needed. That night, she told Calloway about it. She told him about the journal, about his grandparents' story, about the words that seemed written for them. He listened in silence, with an expression that oscillated between surprise and emotion. "I never knew any of this," he said when she finished. "My grandmother was always a reserved woman. She never talked about the past." "Maybe she didn't need to," replied Wren. "Maybe she knew that one day someone would find these words and need them." Calloway took the journal with reverence, running his fingers over the worn leather. "Do you think they were right?" he asked. "That love is built?" "I think we're already building it," Wren replied. "Brick by brick." He lifted his gaze to her, and for the first time since they had met, Wren saw in his eyes something that wasn't fear or protection or distance. It was hope. Peace didn't last long. It arrived in the form of a certified letter, delivered one February morning by a messenger with a grave expression. Calloway opened it in his office while Wren watched, and she saw him pale as he read. "What's wrong?" she asked, feeling fear grip her stomach. "An audit," he replied in a dry voice. "They've found irregularities in the accounts. Someone has been embezzling money for years." "How much money?" "Enough to destroy the company." The following days were a hell of meetings with lawyers, accountants, and auditors. Wren watched from the periphery, feeling useless but refusing to abandon Calloway in those dark hours. It was during one of those meetings that she heard the name that changed everything. "The transfers were made to an account in Switzerland," explained the chief auditor, "and that account is linked to a name that appears in the company records, Ezekiel Hartwell." Wren's world collapsed. Her grandfather, the man who had raised her, who had taught her everything she knew about the land and vines, the man for whom she had married a stranger, a thief. "That's impossible," she heard her own voice, trembling but firm. "My grandfather would never do something like that." "The evidence is quite clear, ma'am," replied the auditor without looking at her. "His name appears on all the relevant documents." Wren sought Calloway's gaze, expecting to find doubt, accusation, distance. But what she found was something completely different: trust. "I want to see all those documents," he said. "Every one of them. And I want a complete investigation before accusing anyone." Days turned into weeks. Wren struggled between loyalty to her grandfather and the corrosive doubt that threatened to poison everything she believed in. She visited Ezekiel at his farmhouse, seeking answers that the old man couldn't give her, because he didn't even understand what he was being accused of. "My child," he told her with eyes full of confusion, "I've never had access to the Ashworth accounts. How could I have embezzled money from a company I don't even know?" It was a logical question, a question Wren had asked herself dozens of times. The answer came from the most unexpected source: Dashiell, Calloway's younger brother. Dashiell was the opposite of his brother in almost everything. Where Calloway was reserved, Dashiell was expansive. Where Calloway worked, Dashiell squandered. For years he had lived in the shadow of the firstborn, resentful of not being the heir, embittered by what he perceived as family injustices. It was Millicent, the housekeeper, who discovered it. "Mrs. Wren," she woke her one night with an agitated expression, "I think you should see this." She led her to Calloway's office, where she had found a folder that Dashiell had left forgotten after a visit the day before. Inside were documents that told a very different story from the one the auditors had presented. Dashiell had falsified the evidence. He had used the name of Ezekiel Hartwell, an elderly farmer who didn't even know how to use a computer, as a cover to hide his own thefts. He had counted on the fact that Wren's marital relationship with Calloway would create a conflict of interest that would prevent a thorough investigation. He had planned to destroy the marriage and take over the company. The confrontation took place in the main salon, with witnesses present to ensure there would be no doubts. Dashiell denied everything at first, but when the lawyers presented irrefutable evidence, including communications with Swiss banks he had forgotten to delete, his facade crumbled. "You were always the favorite," he shouted at Calloway, his face contorted with rage. The heir, the genius, the untouchable. And what about me, the scraps, the second son nobody took seriously? You were my brother, Calloway replied in an icy voice. I gave you every opportunity, positions in the company, investments, support, and this is how you repay me. You owed me everything should have been mine. The police arrived shortly after. There was no arrest. The family preferred to keep the matter discreet. But Dashiell was banished from Napa Valley with the promise that if he ever set foot on those lands again, the consequences would be severe. When it was all over, when the house fell silent and the echoes of the confrontation dissipated, Wren found herself facing a decision she hadn't expected. Calloway found her in the garden, where she was contemplating the first almond blossoms announcing spring's arrival. We could have sent him to prison, she said without turning. There was enough evidence. I know. But you didn't. No. Calloway was silent for a moment. Despite everything, he's my brother. Wren nodded slowly. I would have done the same, she confessed, if it had been my family. I know. He looked at her with an expression that contained admiration, respect, and something more. That's why I asked you to be lenient with him, because I knew that you, who had every right to demand revenge, would choose forgiveness. And Mrs. Vivian? Asked Wren. Did she know anything about this? No, but when she found out, I think something changed in her. I think she finally understood she had been wrong, about Dashiell, about you, about many things. Wren didn't respond. She wasn't ready to forgive her mother-in-law, not yet, but perhaps with time that moment would come too. For now, it was enough to know that the truth had come to light, and that her grandfather Ezekiel, the man who had taught her everything about the land and love, had been exonerated. The delivery came early. Wren was only 7 months pregnant when, one April night, she woke up with pains that doubled her over. Calloway, who had insisted on sleeping beside her since the Dashiell crisis had ended, reacted with a speed that belied his apparent calm. The hospital in St. Helena received them with the efficiency typical of emergencies. Doctors and nurses moved around Wren in a ballet of white coats and monitor beeps. Calloway stayed at her side, holding her hand so tightly that both their knuckles whitened. Everything's going to be okay, he whispered in her ear, repeating the words like a prayer. You're the strongest woman I know. Our daughter is going to be fine. Because they had discovered it was a girl. A small creature they had spent months imagining, naming, dreaming about. The cesarean was quick but intense, and when finally the cry of a baby filled the operating room, they both felt the world stop. She's very small, the doctor warned them. She'll have to stay in the incubator for a few weeks, but she's strong, the vital signs are good. They named her Dawn, because she had arrived in a moment of darkness and had illuminated them both. The following weeks were the most difficult and the most beautiful of their lives. They spent hours beside the small glass incubator, watching the rise and fall of the tiny chest, counting each breath as if it were a miracle. She has your eyes, Calloway observed one night, when they were alone in the neonatal unit. She has your nose, Wren replied. Poor thing. She laughed, an unexpected sound in that place of machines and worries. It was in that hospital twilight, with the rhythmic beeping of the monitors as background, that Calloway finally said the words, I love you, Wren. She looked up. Her heart stopped for an instant. Not by contract, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. Not by obligation. I love you. For who you are. For how you've changed me. For the life we're building together. Tears ran down Wren's cheeks, but they were tears of joy. I love you too, she replied. I think I started loving you before I realized it. That night after the wedding when you stayed with me until dawn, even then I knew there was something special about you. They embraced beside their daughter's incubator, two souls who had started as strangers and had become everything to each other. When they could finally bring Dawn home, the estate had changed. The heavy curtains had been replaced by light fabrics that let in the spring sun. The rooms had been repainted with warm colors, and in the room that had once been the storage for sad paintings, there was now a bright studio where Calloway was painting again. But this time his paintings were different. Vivid colors, landscapes full of life, portraits of Wren with Dawn in her arms. The melancholy had been replaced by hope. And Mrs. Vivian, The fearsome mother-in-law, who had done everything possible to destroy that marriage, arrived one day with tears in her eyes and a request for forgiveness on her lips. "I was wrong," she said, holding her granddaughter for the first time. "I was wrong about everything, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I regret it, deeply." Wren observed her for a long moment. She saw the proud woman reduced to vulnerability, saw the genuine love with which she looked at Dawn, saw the repentance that shone in her eyes. "Forgiveness is built," she finally replied, remembering the words from Grandmother Ophelia's journal. "Day by day, choice by choice. I'm willing to try if you are too." Mrs. Vivian nodded, tears flowing freely down her aristocratic face. And at that moment, surrounded by 3 generations of Ashworths, Wren knew she had finally found her place in the world. Summer arrived with all its Napa Valley splendor. The vineyards stretched in a sea of green under the intense blue sky, and the air smelled of warm earth and slowly ripening grapes. Little Dawn, now 3 months old, had left behind the fragility of her premature birth and had become a chubby baby with rosy cheeks and an easy laugh. It was then that Calloway proposed the trip to Vermont. "I want them to meet my grandparents," he said one morning during breakfast. "Grandmother Ophelia and Grandfather Archibald, I think it's time." Wren felt a knot of emotion in her stomach. After reading the journal, she felt a deep connection with that woman she had never met. The idea of finally finding her, of thanking her for the words that had changed her life, was exciting and terrifying in equal parts. The journey lasted several hours, crossing landscapes that gradually changed from the wine country hills of California to the green mountains of New England. The monastery was on the outskirts of Woodstock, Vermont, an ancient stone building surrounded by silent gardens where time seemed to have stopped. The abbess received them with courtesy, but with warnings. "Mr. Archibald and Mrs. Ophelia no longer receive visitors," she explained. "They chose complete retreat years ago, but when I told them that their great-granddaughter wanted to meet them, well, it was the first time in a long time that I saw Mrs. Ophelia smile." They were led through silent cloisters to a small interior garden where 2 elderly people waited, seated on a stone bench. Archibald, at 92, had his gaze lost somewhere on the horizon, but Ophelia, at 90, maintained surprisingly vivid eyes that lit up when she saw them approach. "So you're the girl who found my journal," she said in a soft but clear voice. Wren nodded, unable to speak from emotion. "Come, sit beside me." The old woman patted the space next to her. "And let me see that little one." Calloway placed Dawn in his great-grandmother's arms. The baby, normally restless with strangers, stayed perfectly still, observing the wrinkled face with a solemnity unusual for her age. "She has the Ashworth eyes," observed Ophelia, "but her spirit is different. It's free, like yours." "I found your journal by chance," Wren finally said, "and it changed everything. Your words about love, about building it day by day, I don't know how to thank you." The old woman smiled. "There's nothing to thank, child. I wrote those words for myself to remember in difficult moments, but if they've also served you, then they had a greater purpose." "How did you know?" asked Calloway, who had remained silent until then. "How did you know your marriage would work? With everything against you, with everyone telling you it was a mistake." Archibald, who seemed lost in his thoughts, slowly turned his head toward his grandson. "We didn't know," he said in a raspy but firm voice. "We never knew. Every day we woke up wondering if this would be the day everything would fall apart. But every day we chose to stay. And in the end, 60 years of staying became a life." Ophelia nodded. "Love isn't a destination, my dears. It's a journey. And the most beautiful journeys are those we undertake without knowing exactly where they'll take us." They spent the afternoon in that silent garden, listening to stories from the past, sharing hopes for the future. When finally the time came to say goodbye, Ophelia took Wren's hand with surprising strength. "Take care of my grandson," she told her, "and let him take care of you. That's all it takes." "I will," Wren promised. "I promise." The return journey was silent but not uncomfortable. Wren held Dawn against her chest while watching the landscape pass by the window. Beside her, Calloway drove with a thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" she finally asked. "About time," he replied. "About how many opportunities I wasted. How many years I spent building walls when I could have been building something like what my grandparents have. But you're already doing it. I know. He took her free hand and squeezed it gently. And that's what amazes me most. That, after everything, after Rosalind, after the years of bitterness, it's still possible. We still have time. Ren brought his hand to her lips and kissed it. We always have time, she murmured, as long as we choose to be there. Autumn returned to Napa Valley, bringing with it the most important harvest of their lives. But this time, it wasn't just a grape harvest that was at stake. It was a celebration, a rebirth, a closure. Calloway had decided to organize a special party, a gathering of everyone who had been part of their journey during that transformative year. Grandfather Ezekiel, completely exonerated and his dignity restored. Mrs. Vivian, who had spent months rebuilding her relationship with her son and daughter-in-law. The winery employees who had celebrated Dawn's birth as if she were a daughter of them all. Even Edward had agreed to leave his monastery in New Mexico to attend, but there was something more that Calloway had planned. A secret only he knew. The party took place in the estate gardens, under a sky that was painting itself orange and pink with the sunset. Paper lanterns hung from the trees, an orchestra played traditional California melodies, and the tables overflowed with the family's finest wines and regional dishes. Wren moved among the guests with Dawn in her arms, radiant in a burgundy velvet dress that matched the colors of autumn. She accepted congratulations, shared laughs, watched her grandfather Ezekiel chat animatedly with Edward about cultivation techniques while Mrs. Vivian held the little one with a tenderness no one would have believed possible a year ago. It was then that the music stopped. Calloway appeared in the center of the garden, under an arch of wildflowers that Wren hadn't noticed before. He had an expression she couldn't interpret, nervous, emotional, vulnerable. "Wren," his voice resonated in the sudden silence. "Can you come here, please?" She approached with her heart racing. What was happening? When she reached his side, he took both her hands and looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "A year ago," he began, "you signed a marriage contract. You did it out of obligation, out of loyalty to your family, expecting nothing in return. And I accepted that contract thinking it was the safest thing. A marriage without love, without risks, without the possibility of suffering." Wren felt tears threatening to burst forth. "But I was wrong," Calloway continued. "Love isn't a risk to protect yourself from. It's a gift to open yourself to. And you, Wren Josephine Hartwell, have given me more than I ever thought I deserved." He knelt before her, taking from his pocket a small velvet box. "Today, a year after our marriage of convenience, I want to ask you something I should have asked from the beginning." He opened the box, revealing a ring with a solitary diamond that sparkled like a star. "Will you marry me, Wren? Not by contract, not by obligation, but because you love me as much as I love you. Will you truly be my wife?" The silence was absolute. 100 faces watched, holding their breath, and Wren, tears flowing freely down her cheeks, felt her heart burst with joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Calloway stood and kissed her. A long, deep kiss, full of promises kept and promises to keep. Around them the guests burst into applause, but they heard nothing but the beating of their own hearts. When they finally separated, Wren saw that everyone was crying. Grandfather Ezekiel, Edward, even Mrs. Vivian, who held little Dawn against her chest while tears fell down her aristocratic cheeks. The orchestra began to play again, this time a soft waltz. And as Calloway took her in his arms to dance under the stars of Napa Valley, Wren knew with absolute certainty that this was the end of a chapter and the beginning of a much larger story. A story they would write together, day by day, choice by choice, forever. The chapel in Sonoma stood on a hill, small and ancient, with stone walls that had seen centuries of history pass. From up there, you could see the vines stretching to the horizon, the terracotta roofs of the small town, the distant silhouette of the Pacific coastline. It was the perfect place to renew their vows. Wren waited by the altar, this time without trembling hands, without fear in her heart. She was dressed in white again, but everything else was different. At her side was Dawn, now 1-year-old, held by her great-grandmother Ophelia, who had left the monastery for a day to be present. In the front rows, Grandfather Ezekiel shared a pew with Mrs. Vivian, both smiling with tears in their eyes. Edward, in his monastic habit, waited to officiate the ceremony. And walking toward her down the aisle of wildflowers was Calloway. But he wasn't the same man who had signed that contract a year ago. The shadows had disappeared from his grey eyes, replaced by a warm light. He was smiling, a wide, genuine smile that transformed his severe face into something beautiful. And when he reached her side, he took her hands with a tenderness that said more than 1,000 words. "Today," Edward began in a solemn but affectionate voice, "we are here to celebrate something extraordinary. Not a contract, but a commitment. Not an obligation, but a choice." Wren and Calloway looked at each other as the priest continued speaking. They remembered everything they had been through, the initial agreement, the doubts, the fears, the fire at the winery, Rosalind's return, the discovery of the pregnancy, the humiliation of the dinner with investors, Dashiell's betrayal, Dawn's premature birth, the long nights at the hospital, the words of love finally spoken. Each obstacle had strengthened them. Each wound had brought them closer. "The vows you will pronounce today," Edward continued, "are not new. They are the same that are said in every marriage. But for you, these words have a special meaning, because you have already lived them. You have already tested them. You already know you're capable of keeping them." Calloway was the first to speak. "Wren," he said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion, "a year ago, I promised you a comfortable life in exchange for your company. It was the worst deal I've ever made in my life, because I had no idea what you were really giving me." He paused, searching for words. "You gave me light when I only knew shadows. You gave me hope when I had given up on dreaming. You gave me love when I believed my heart was dead. And you gave me Dawn, our little star, who illuminates every corner of our life. Today I promise you what I should have promised from the beginning. My whole heart, without reservations, without walls. I promise to choose you every day, in good times and difficult ones. I promise to build with you day by day, choice by choice, the true love my grandmother spoke of. I love you, Wren. I will always love you." Wren felt tears running down her cheeks, but she did nothing to stop them. "Calloway," she began, her voice trembling but clear, "a year ago I entered this life thinking it was a sacrifice. I had no idea I was entering the greatest blessing of my existence. You weren't the Iceman everyone described. You were a wounded man, an artist hiding his sensitivity, a heart waiting to be awakened. And when you finally let me see you truly, when you lowered your defenses and showed me who you really were, I fell in love, completely, irremediably, eternally. I promise to be your companion in this life and in all that may come. I promise to remind you on difficult days that you are loved. I promise to keep reading your eyes, as my grandmother taught me, to know what you need, even when you can't say it. I love you, Calloway, with everything I am and everything I will be." Edward blessed them as they exchanged the new rings, gold bands set with small diamonds that symbolized the stars under which they had fallen in love. "What God has joined," he proclaimed, "let no man separate. But more important still, what true love has built, neither time nor difficulties will be able to destroy." When they kissed, applause filled the small chapel. Dawn cooed in her great-grandmother's arms. Grandfather Ezekiel blew his nose loudly. Mrs. Vivian wept openly. Outside, the bells began to ring, their sound traveling over the vineyards to the distant valleys.